Good afternoon, everyone. If you are joining us this afternoon for the VCE Business Management Study Design PL webinar, we are about to get started. It has just hit 4 o'clock, so welcome. If you could just jump on into the chat and introduce yourself and the school you're at, that would be great. We'll just give people another minute or two to join us, but while we wait, jump on into the chat, introduce yourself. When you are posting into the chat, please just make sure that you are posting to all members, not just to the hosts and panelists. Otherwise, not everyone will be able to see. So we'll be getting started really shortly. Jump on into the chat, say hello, and we'll kick off in another minute or so. Appreciate it's Tuesday, busy day probably for everyone. Getting out of class, finding a quiet place at school to sit down with a computer. So we'll just give them another minute or two. As I said, jump onto the chat, introduce yourself and the school you are at, and we'll get started. If you haven't found the chat function, it's just down at the bottom of the screen. If you click on the chat with the speech bubble, it should open up a panel on the side where you can post messages. It's also where you can post questions throughout the session. Once Kristen gets underway, if there are things that you want to ask. We do also have a Q&A function as well down the bottom. So if you have a really burning question, you can pop it in there. I see that chat is disabled. Thanks, Rachel, for mentioning that, and Christine as well has just mentioned that. So I'll let Kristen and Dion just enable the chat function. Thanks for
We'll just sort that out now. Thanks, Clinton.
Perfect. And then we'll get started in just one more minute. But it's great. Rachel and Christine have already discovered the Q&A function. The good thing about Q&A is that you can vote up comments. So if you do have a really kind of burning question you want to put in there, put it into the Q&A function rather than the chat, because it can get a bit lost in the chat when it is working. And the Q&A, we can also just make sure we don't lose it as we go through the session. So we are intending to finish at 5 o'clock or just about there. Appreciate that everyone has had busy days at school and no doubt busy evenings ahead as well. So we are going to get started. As I said, the chat function is just being sorted out, but once it is working, you can jump on in there and introduce yourself and the school you're from. But while we sort that out, I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all gathered on this afternoon across Victoria. I see we have almost 30 people joining us, so no doubt there's a great spread from across the state. For us here in Melbourne CBD, just opposite the Melbourne Exhibition Centre and the museum, it is Wurundjeri and Wonwurrung people land that we are on, so we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. I will also just point out as we kick off here, we have just launched this year our new resources for Year 7 Maths and Science, and Year 8 is ready for 2023, along with Humanities for Year 7. So that is all exciting news for us here, and encourage you to let any of your colleagues know who might be teaching either math, science or humanities in the junior years to let us know. Textbook, full digital online resources as well, the same quality that you'd expect or you've come to expect from Edrolo. So please share that with any colleagues where it might be relevant. So that is all from me. I think in terms of housekeeping, I had already mentioned, in case you missed it, just to pop your questions into the Q&A. We know the Q&A is definitely working. Not sure if the chat is working yet. It's very quiet over there, but we know Q&A is. So please just pop your questions into the Q&A. We can make sure we answer those. And I did see, if you just pop back to the previous slide, Kristen, for a second, I did just have up there as well, you can stay up to date with all the things happening at Edrolo across the social channels. Across Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook. It's where we share all the kind of latest news, tips, tricks, webinars, the recordings, etc. for these sessions, but we will also email those out to you later this week, along with your certificate of participation for this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kristen, who's going to talk you through the study design changes for business management. Thanks, Kristen.
Okay, thank you, Clinton. And apologies again, everyone, that the chat function, we're just having some technical difficulties here. But what we can do is, if you had something that you were going to put into the chat, if you could just pop that into the Q&A section, I think that should just still give us the functionality that we need. And as Clinton was asking before, if you do have the chance, can you just pop in details of who you are and the school that you're currently teaching at? And we at least can have that opportunity to know who is here with us today. And I'll introduce myself next up. So my name is Kristen. I'm the project lead for VCE Business Management. I've been working in education for about 19 years. And that's as a teacher, curriculum designer, assessor, moderator, and project manager. So I'm currently managing the project for this VCE Business Management textbook for the new study design. So that's a lot of time I've spent in secondary and tertiary, doing a lot of educational work in business, economics, legal, humanities, and accounting in Melbourne and London. So that's a lot of different curricula, including VCE, A-levels, and Monash University foundation year. So I've also done some work as an examiner for Monash Uni, curriculum designer. I've also been a past VCAR assessor for business management, and done some other work for Swinburne and some other of the commercial resource companies. I'm also a qualified lawyer, but I haven't actually practiced yet, but maybe I will one day. And what I'm doing at the moment is, along with my team, I've spent quite a few months immersed in this new VCE Business Management study design and Edrolo's textbook for that. So just before we get started, a little icebreaker, even though we're online, so it's a little bit harder to break ice online, but still, if you could just pop in not the chat because it's not working, but in the Q&A section, just a number, where you're feeling or how you're feeling, where you're at the moment in terms of thinking about the VCE Business Management study design. Maybe you haven't even looked at it yet and you're not sure, or maybe you have had a look and you're feeling a bit worried or thinking about how you're going to implement it. If you just pop in the Q&A just for a bit of fun, what number baby are you at the moment? Now, just see if I can access that information, if anybody's popped that in yet. I can see, yeah, it is possible. So yeah, if you've just joined us, you may not have been here at the start, but we're having a little bit of trouble with our chat function today for some strange reason, but we can just ask you to put your comments in the Q&A section.
Quite a few number ones there, Kristen, which is tired, which is no surprise as we head into term 3.
Yeah, I feel you. This is probably one of the busiest times of the year for a VCE teacher. I would imagine, and I can remember from when I've been in that position myself. So I really appreciate people turning up today and having at least some energy to look at these study design changes with us.
Rodney gave it a 3 though, Kristen. Rodney gave it an excited, which I think that's got to get a special mention on a Tuesday afternoon.
Amazing. All right. Well, the aim of today, I will go through the official aims, but one of the aims for today is to turn everybody into either baby number 2 or baby number 3. So it's great to know that we already have some baby number 3s out there. All right. Well, we'll get started on the main information for today. So our learning intentions are to understand the changes to the VCE BizMan study design, and then also understand how Edrolo can help you implement those changes. So a little disclaimer just before we get started with some of those changes. We are not the VCAA. We can only sort of explain our interpretation of that study design. I'm certainly not a number 1 expert on these changes, as I didn't write the curriculum, but the team here at Edrolo have spent considerable time analysing the changes. We have had the resources to devote to analysing the content changes and the assessment changes, the key skills changes. at great length, and we've also been able to chase some things up with VCAR if there's ever any ambiguity, if we've not understood what the interpretation should be. So, for example, we've consulted with VCAR regarding changes to the force field analysis dot point, just so that we understood the correct approach to take so that we could arrange our textbook chapters accordingly. So there are some subjective topics, obviously, in business management where we will research further, we will contact VCAR if we need to, and we will consult many resources to make sure that we are providing the correct information and the correct level of depth. We also do extensive analysis on past exams so that we understand the types of questions that might be asked around each sort of dot point and the types of skills and command terms that will be used. We align our exam style questions for students to practice with. We align them very closely and provide learning opportunities throughout the textbook to provide students with that knowledge and the skills they need for the exam. So let's get on with having a look at the content changes. Just move along. So our roadmap for this hour, the webinar, is just shown there on the screen. We're going through the aims of the study design, just looking at the importance of contemporary case studies, which I'm sure you're all well aware of already in the existing study design. We'll look at the content changes in detail, then look at the skills changes, small assessment changes, and then I'll just go through with you some of the examples of how we've approached those changes and just generally the study design in our textbook. And then I'll pass on to my colleague Dion, who will talk about our online platform. All right, so I'm not sure if anyone has questions already, but what I will say is that there will be a chance to sort of pause to have a look at some questions in the Q&A section. If you've just joined us, the chat function is not working, but we do encourage you to put questions in the Q&A. If you've got, you should have that feature on your screen. So we will have a bit of a time to get to those questions as we break from looking at some of these slides in a moment. And I should also say that if we do only have an hour today, and I don't really want to be keeping anyone longer than 5 o'clock. So if we do get a whole bunch of questions that we won't have time to get through today, we're certainly happy. We do have a recording of those, and we will certainly get back to everybody via email to give you answers to those if we can't answer them in time today. All right, so just let's have a quick look at the aims of the study design. There's not a lot that's changed here. I just thought I would highlight one sort of half a sentence has been added there just to highlight how businesses must adapt to change, which we know has already been a big part of the study design, the existing study design. So I'm not sure of the significance of that, but I thought I'd just make a note of that there. But not a significant change, as we will see in some of the other dot points in the areas of study. In terms of contemporary case studies, there hasn't been much of a change there. They are still a big focus of the study design. So whilst there haven't been any sort of changes to the requirements, other than we'll talk about it in Unit 4, where there is a mention of one or more contemporary case studies, whereas the existing study design talks about a case study. We will get to that. But in terms of how Edrolo approach contemporary case studies, we have had in the past in our textbook real world examples attached to each dot point, often attached to each concept within each dot point. But what we're adding to our new textbook next year is looking at those contemporary case studies in detail and having an explainer at the beginning of our book that talks about how to approach and how to utilise those contemporary case studies in exam questions. We also have extended, so longer real world examples in each chapter to provide a little bit more depth and a little bit more context to some of the dot points. We also have in each section of our textbook, which is basically lined up with each area of study, a number of contemporary case studies with exam style questions to do a review at the end of each area of study. So we're always trying to line things up with both the section A and the section B of the exam. All right, so we'll move on to looking at content changes next. So as we go through, it might be just helpful to sort of I guess, get a feel for how others in the webinar are feeling about these changes as we go. So if you do want to add something to the Q&A function, not the chat function, because that's not working for us today. If we're looking at a particular change to content or to skills or assessment, if you've got something that you would like to highlight, something you're happy about, something you're worried about, or something interesting, feel free to add a comment or even just a plus, minus, or interesting to the Q&A. And it might just be interesting to see what other people, if they're feeling similarly to you, are. All right, let's get on with it though. Unit 1, start with that one, area of study 1. Not a huge amount of change here. We can just see in our summary table here, we've got some content removed, some content added. Business mentorships is a tiny aspect of one of the dot points that's been removed. We now have the concept of entrepreneurship as a separate standalone dot point, which I don't think really causes much of a change really to how you might deliver, because obviously that concept was essentially part of one of the other dot points on characteristics of entrepreneurs anyway. But we also have the importance of decision making explicitly added to that dot point about importance of goal setting. So some slight changes to wording other than that. And there is also something in I think it's the intro or the summary for this AOS where there is a slight addition just emphasising further that the importance of business to national economy and social well-being. All right, move on though to area of study 2. Before we do, it's important to note that there is a structural change in Unit 1, whereby AOS 2 and AOS 3 have actually been swapped around. Whether or not that means you're going to change the order in which you teach them, I'm not sure, but they are now specified in a separate order. So we now have area of study 2 is now internal business environment and planning, whereas it used to be the external environment was area of study 2. So slight addition to that in the summary, just talking a little bit more about business objectives. I'm not sure of the significance of that, but in terms of dot points that have been added, you can see those listed there. Relationship between internal and external environments is now in this section with the internal environment, just because this one now comes first. But it's also notable that social enterprise and government business enterprise have been added to the dot point about the types of business structures. And that's in line with what they do in Unit 3 as well. So that makes sense. And just also in terms of types of business models, there's now direct to consumer business added to the explicit list of items in that dot point. In terms of the third one there with the addition, it seems that the SWOT analysis dot point has just been qualified a bit further to talk about planning analysis tools, and it's just saying regarding changing internal factors. So a slight change to wording there, essentially. And that's probably true across the whole area of study. There's not a lot of change other than those in the added column there, other than some rephrasing, which essentially I would interpret that as just qualifying that dot point further rather than adding content. So just a reminder that as we go through these changes, if there's anything that really strikes you as interesting, feel free to add a comment to the Q&A, mostly for each other's benefit, but we will also look at these, and if we've got any comments or answers to any of the questions you might pose in that Q&A, we will try and answer them when we pause for a break in a moment, or we will try and get back to you via email after the webinar. All right, let's finish with Unit 1 though. Here is area of study 3. So as I mentioned, it's a structural change where there's a swap. We have area of study 3 is now the external business environment, and planning has been added to that title. So obviously, because we've already looked at the relationship between internal and external in the last area of study, that has slightly changed from that summary. So a removal from this section is a reference to the internal environment, as I said, because it's kind of covered already in that area of study 2, which is now about the internal environment. But in terms of added dot points, we have a slight change to the dot point about technological issues. It's now referred to as considerations, which is probably not significant in terms of how you're going to teach or deliver that. But also there is that addition about how businesses adapt. And we did mention that that was an addition to the aims section. So there does seem to be a strong emphasis on businesses adapting, which already has been emphasised in the existing study design, but it's now explicitly mentioned a little more often in that study design. Global issues or global considerations, as it's now called, not a lot has changed for that dot point. I just thought I would point out this, the trend throughout the study design, whereby anything that was referred to as an issue has generally been now referred to as a consideration. The dot point on corporate social responsibility, again, not a great deal of change. It's just that addition in bold there relating to business planning. So a bit of more of a strong emphasis on business planning there. In terms of other changes, there is another dot point that has something added and something removed from it. Employment levels is now one of the economic conditions to focus on, but business confidence has been removed from that dot point for some reason. All right, let's move on to Unit 2. This is a quick one. Area of Study 1, legal and financial considerations, just one dot point added there, which is an overview of the role of external professionals. That's the only change for that area of study. Let's move on to AOS 2 for Unit 2, marketing. The AOS summary now refers to technology, and that makes sense because there's now a dot point on technological developments that has been added, brand new dot point there. And there's a slight change to the dot point about corporate social responsibility. Again, changing the word issues to considerations. And there's also addition there, the protection of consumer privacy is explicitly mentioned in that dot point now. All right, that was a quick one. I think Unit 2 probably has fewer changes. This one here, Area of Study 3 in Unit 2, a few things removed here. Employment arrangements, you no longer need to explicitly cover full-time, part-time, contractual and casual. Global issues such as overseas recruitment has been removed, but we will see that it's kind of been added to another dot point there. The dot point on legal obligations for OH&S and equal opportunities. It's now slightly changed in that it refers to legislation explicitly now, and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency is no longer explicitly mentioned in that dot point. What has been added, though, is an overview of the National Employment Standards. And you can see there that the dot point about corporate social responsibility now refers also to overseas recruitment, which is, I think, partly compensating for the fact that it was removed from the other dot point. All right, so that's Unit 2, changes to content. We'll move on to Unit 3 and obviously Unit 4, where I think there's probably lots of sort of smaller changes that are maybe more significant, and especially so because obviously with Units 3 and 4, there is that external assessment, the exam, where it is quite important that these things are covered adequately. So I imagine Units 3 and 4 are the ones that people are probably very interested in and really wanting to make sure that there's a good understanding of that before you start delivering this next year. Okay, so for Unit 3, Area of Study 1, quite a few changes there. In terms of what has been removed, there's a whole dot point removed there from AOS 1 on the areas of management responsibility. So I think the significance of that, I do think it's quite notable in that if you've got students that haven't studied Units 1 and 2, they won't necessarily have an understanding of business functions such as marketing or finance and so on. So perhaps it's important to sort of understand that dot point's been removed. You might be sort of relying on students to have some prior knowledge around those areas and to sort of factor that into your lesson planning. And that's certainly what we have considered as we've designed our lessons for our textbook. Another thing that's been removed is just from the dot point about corporate culture, just that the bit that's been crossed out there, the strategies for its development. So it hasn't been removed from the study design because it's actually kind of been moved to Unit 4, which we'll see shortly. But it just means that the focus on that dot point is just about the concept of real and official corporate culture, rather than the strategies as well. Now, in addition to the area of study 1 and to the dot point on business objectives is those two business objectives to improve efficiency and to improve effectiveness. Now, I found that a little problematic when I first looked at it, because obviously improving effectiveness is about improving your ability or your achievement of all the other business objectives on that list for that dot point. So that is one that we've thought a lot about, and we've made sure that our explanation of that in the textbook and the activities and questions around that are able to clear up any confusion that students might also have when they see that as a new or as a business objective. It's new to us in the study design. So that's something we've thought a lot about and made sure that it's going to hopefully not be confusing for students, even though it has the potential to do so. All right, so the other addition to area of study 1 is about stakeholders of businesses. Obviously, we had that already, or we have that in the existing study design, but now in the new study design, they are explicitly listed. So there's a chance for students to find out who they are before they start looking at their interests and their conflicts and so on. Small other change is just the removal of CSR from the dot point about the characteristics and the conflicts between stakeholders. And I suspect that's simply because now we're looking at the general community as an explicit stakeholder. Perhaps that covers the CSR consideration inherently in that anyway. Not to mention CSR is covered across the rest of the course as well. So perhaps that explains its removal here. All right, area of study 2 for Unit 3, a name change here, going from managing employees to now human resource management, and that's sort of reflected across the dot points and the summary of that area of study. Besides those slight wording changes, there's not a lot changed in this area of study. Grievance procedures has been removed from the dot point about dispute resolution process. And then you can see there are just a few wording changes. I wouldn't interpret those as being too significant, more so about just qualifying and clarifying what each dot point's about. Okay. All right, last area of study for Unit 3. So operations management. There seem to be a few changes in here, but I think most of them will probably be welcomed because, again, they're providing more information to clarify what teachers and students need to cover. So just starting with what's been removed, just a small thing removed from the global considerations dot point, an overview of supply chain management has been removed there. What's been added, though, is probably quite helpful, I would expect. So the dot point on waste minimisation has now been qualified with the addition of what explicitly should be covered there, which is reduce, reuse and recycle. So I think that's probably helpful to know what specifically to cover there. And the same thing for the new dot point on lean management. So you can see that's been removed from one dot point, and there's now a full dot point on lean management where it goes through the different types of strategies relating to lean management. So I would suspect that that's quite helpful to be able to target lessons towards those particular strategies. And that's exactly what we have done with our lessons in our textbook. Besides that, some other changes there to area of study 3 are just the addition of some particular technological developments, including robotics is a new one, artificial intelligence, and online services seems to be there to replace website development. But it is important to note that the online services will encompass more than simply website development. And so we've made sure that we've included lots of different aspects of that in the textbook. All right, we're nearly through. This is the lengthiest part of the changes, has been the changes to the content and the dot points and so on. So we're up to Unit 4. And I would say this is, again, like Unit 3, quite, you know, some of the bigger changes are in Units 3 and 4. But again, not a huge amount of change so much, but more so qualifying the dot points to provide that context of what is meant to be covered within the dot point. So I think they're probably quite helpful changes. Before we look at the actual content and the topics and how they've changed, I think it might be relevant to note that the reference to contemporary case studies for Unit 4, it talks about one or more contemporary case studies rather than simply a contemporary case study. So I think that should really signify that it's possible or advisable to be looking at more than one company when you're looking at your change case studies, whereas I think in the past it was probably focusing on one company and sticking with that company throughout, whereas what we've done with the textbook as well is we use many, many different examples of companies for each area of study and throughout the textbook as a whole, so that students can draw upon examples from many different contemporary case studies. Because often if you're looking at the one company, they might not have a good example to really relate to a particular dot point. Whereas if you're looking at a few different companies in relation to these areas of study, you probably find that there's some really good examples across that collection of companies that you've studied. So we try to include many, many different examples of companies, and we often will always use the most you know, relevant company for the particular dot point or the particular concept that we're trying to illustrate in our real world examples. Okay, so in terms of dot points and content changes, there is now an explicit dot point on proactive and reactive approaches to change. So that's new, looking at the different types of business change. Key performance indicators, we now have an additional one, number of website hits. Now, force field analysis theory. This was one that certainly stumped a few of us here at Edrolo, just in terms of wanting to be able to interpret this correctly and make sure that the focus we had on this dot point was, you know, absolutely as VCAR intended. So we've actually consulted with VCAR and got a little bit more information about what should be expected for these new additions to the dot point. The principles or the steps in force field analysis are now explicitly in that dot point. So that includes the weighting, ranking, implementing response, and evaluating the response. We've done as much as we can to make sure that we have interpreted that as VCAR have intended, by getting a lot of advice from them around that when we were writing that textbook chapter. So we've done that with a few of our chapters as well, but this was one that I think is quite necessary to do, because it could have been a little bit ambiguous in terms of how we interpreted those principles. And what we've done is we've made it very clear in our textbook and for students to understand that those 4 principles are also obviously steps or stages in a process, that process of force field analysis. Besides that, that was probably the major change, the force field analysis. But besides that, we also have owners added as a particular driving force in that dot point. Okay, no other changes there. So we'll move on to area of study 2 in Unit 4, last one for content changes. We can see that there's a dot point has been removed, management strategies to seek new business opportunities, both domestically and globally. I think generally they have been, that's been encompassed in some of the other dot points over here where we've got the additions. So remember, we had back in Unit 3, that corporate culture strategies for development. That was removed from the Unit 3 dot point, but it's now its own explicit dot point here in Unit 4, area of study 2. And you can see that one of the dot points about responding to KPIs the strategies for responding to KPIs, is somewhat combined with seeking new business opportunities. And you can also see that there are some particular strategies that have been added there. Innovation, global sourcing of inputs, overseas manufacture, and global outsourcing, which are probably some of the strategies that would have been included in the dot point that has been removed over there on the left. Besides that, we've got Senge's learning organisation. We now have something added to that to sort of associate that theory with the need to create a positive culture for change. And lastly, we also have owners added to the list of stakeholders there when we're looking at the effect of a change on stakeholder groups. All right, and that's it. We have finished with the content changes. That was the biggest, the largest sort of amount of information to get through with the changes, but we also have some skills changes coming up. Oh, and I've just had my light turn off. I'm just going to pop that back on so everybody can see.
While you do that, Kristen, I'll just respond to Emilio. Yes, Emilio has asked, will the presentation be made available to attendees? Yes, I think we're fine to send the slides out along with the recording of this session and the certificate of participation. So yeah, we can certainly do that. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we will have a pause in just a couple of minutes to sort of have a look at questions. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to keep going, just looking very briefly at skills changes, very briefly at assessment changes before we pause. And I promise it won't take as long as going through the content changes because there really aren't as many. So let's have a quick look at the key skills changes for units 1 and 2. The only difference there in terms of, I guess, the task words that are relevant is discuss and compare are there, whereas they weren't there before. But besides that, there's, I guess, some what I see is a little bit significant removals where students no longer need to identify business opportunities. They no longer need to acquire and record business info, and they no longer need to research. So I kind of interpret that to mean that there's no requirement that students have to do primary research or they have to run their own business necessarily, although they are still options in the assessment, the list of assessments. So I'm not sure, because obviously I don't speak for the VCEA, but I imagine that it's probably a little bit more flexible now in terms of the key skills and the way that they've been listed, that it doesn't sort of have those requirements anymore. Perhaps maybe due to the COVID restrictions and things like that, making it quite difficult to do those things. In terms of units 3 and 4, there are similar differences to what there were for units 1 and 2, in that the discuss and compare is added there, and the requirement to research seems to be gone now, but the instruction is now to analyse. So I won't spend too much more time on skills, but that information is there for you to have a look at. I'll move on to assessment because I'm very conscious of time slipping away from us. For units 1 and 2, there's just an addition there, explicitly mentioned that you can use short answer and extended answer structured questions, which I think would probably have been encompassed in the types of assessments you would have been doing as part of this old study design or existing study design anyway. But it's just that they're explicitly listed there now. A few wording changes, but nothing too significant. In terms of units 3 and 4, there is an addition here saying that the student's performance needs to be assessed using 2 or more of the following items. So case study, structured questions, essay, report, media analysis. I imagine most teachers were probably doing that anyway with their SACs or other assessment tasks. I think maybe it's a good opportunity to put in the Q&A what you have been doing or what you intend to do. I imagine a lot of people were doing case studies along with structured questions before, and in that case you're covering the 2 anyway. Perhaps people are using media analysis as a way to incorporate the contemporary case studies. In any case, I don't think there's a significant change there that's going to affect your delivery, but you do need to make sure you're using 2 or more of those items on the list for your assessment.
All right, we have come to the end of my analysis of those changes, or the summary of those changes. So if you have any comments or questions, hopefully you've been putting them in the Q&A as we've been going through. I don't know, Clinton, if you've been...
There were a couple, Kristen. There were a couple I was able to answer, like, for example, is there a copy of the study design changes as a document? And I put the link in there to the landing page where people can access that. So, but I see there is a question around the when the textbook will be available for teachers. Might be a question for Dion. I'm not sure if you have the answer, Kristen. You're probably really busy writing the final section of it at the moment.
Yeah, I believe that there are sample chapters available now. We're also putting together some samples that will be available for teachers to trial in their Head Start or Step Up programs. And actually, it would be absolutely amazing to get anybody who already has an awareness of what they're going to do during that Head Start or Step Up program in November, I think, for Year 11s and 12s going into next year. If there is a particular topic that you normally start with, I would anticipate it's probably the first area of study of Unit 1 and Unit 3, respectively, for Year 11 and Year 12. But if you have, maybe you do things a little bit differently and you start your Head Start students, or your Step Up, whatever you call them at your school, if you start them on a different chapter, perhaps to, really excite or engage them with a really interesting topic, maybe on marketing or starting a small business or something, be great if you could pop something in the Q&A there to let us know what's the topic that you normally start with, and we can offer samples of that as well if that's what you're using for your Head Start. But generally speaking, we would have our Chapter 1s, which is area of study 1 of both Unit 1 and Unit 3. We'd have those available for you to use in November if you wanted to trial it. We also have sample chapters on our area of study, I think it's area of study 1 of Unit 4, and area of study 2 of Unit 2, I believe it is. I could be wrong because I just did that off the top of my head, but we definitely have sample chapters available. So you can get in touch with us if you are wanting to do that and just trial that out before you decide what you're doing next year. All right, I don't know if there's anything.
And I was just going to say, Kristen, I saw that Emilio also mentioned that Unit 4 AOS 1 sample available. And Keith, I've noted down your name, so I'll also get someone to follow up with you to send those chapters through. So, and I saw Kate just said thank you. Kristen, are there any more questions for Kristen on the content, what's been covered today? I saw Andrea also asked about the books being ready. I think your question has answered that, Kristen, in terms of coming towards the end of the year, but samples are available.
Yeah, what I've got in the next few slides anyway is a little bit of a sample of what's in our book. So I'm very conscious of time. So perhaps I'll just quickly flick through these because I know Dion's got some information for everybody. So maybe I'll quickly run through that now, Clinton, unless you had something else.
Go for it. It gives people another chance to do the questions and then we can throw to Dion.
Okay. All right, this has taken a little bit longer than I thought it was, so I'll quickly breeze through these, hopefully. I just wanted to point out, because this was actually part of what we promised you at the start, our learning goals, was that we were going to tell you how we had approached some of these changes. If you're already using Edrolo, some of these things might be familiar to you, but we've actually changed our approach quite a bit, made lots of improvements to it, to what we've had in our last textbook. And of course, we have an online offering, which Dion's going to talk about shortly. But the focus of the next few slides is what's actually in our textbook. So I won't run through all of these features because it's there on the screen for you. The image there is just sort of an example of what our design looks like, and the fact that we've got sort of this easy navigation with lots of different concept maps. I guess a key feature of what we do at Edrolo is lots of visual summaries, lots of kind of reviewing and summarizing things so that students are really sort of reinforcing the learning throughout. So we have mid-chapter reviews, we have end of area of study reviews, lots of exam style questions, and I can go through a few of those shortly. But basically the way that we've approached and the way that we can help you approach the changes to the study design is just the fact that we do break things down into really minute details. So what we do is we look at each study design dot point, and we pick out the key concepts that are in there that students will be examined on. And we just make sure we've covered all of those to just the right level of depth, without too much complex information for students, but enough so that students are able to grasp that concept and then move on to the next. So I'll move on and just show a few quick examples. Things that are in each lesson. So I did mention this already, that we have a lot of real world examples. We have a lot of visuals, lots of concept maps, summary maps, lots of tables to help show connections between things and to summarize things. We have theory in action examples for year 11, which are more so about hypothetical small businesses to help to just ensure that the examples are simple enough for that level year 11 student to understand and engaging, as well as using real world examples about real life businesses. We also have added a want to know more section about, for concepts that students might want to investigate further, but may not, might be beyond the course. So that's for extending students. Useful tips, things like mnemonics, exam technique advice, and so on. And of course, our questions. And I've just got a few examples here. I think that's probably one of the, I'll just get to the questions in a moment, but our questions are probably one of the best or most effective ways of us addressing the changes to the study design, because we've just made sure there's always practice questions on those new dot points and any changes to the dot points. What's on the screen at the moment, though, is just an example of how we break down that study design. It's very methodical. We move through each area of study, each dot point carefully, making sure we've identified every key concept. We call them key knowledge units within each study design dot point, and then we ensure that they're all covered and there's questions on every single one of those key knowledge units and sub-key knowledge units. We'll just move down. Here's just an example of one of our visual summaries for one of the areas of study. This is Unit 4, Area of Study 1. You'll notice this is one of the areas of study that does have significant change in it. So we've just shown how we've broken that down and how we've shown the relationships between each of the dot points and concepts indeed. Here's just an example of how we approach our activities and also theory review questions. So we have activities in the textbook which are usually used as collaborative activities for small group discussion or large group discussion. They can usually still be done individually if students want to use them at home, but they're options for teachers to use in the classroom. Theory review questions are sort of the easy or the comprehension, consolidating understanding questions for students before they start attempting the more complex exam style questions, which are the higher order thinking skills required. So in terms of our approach to exam questions involving case studies, we make sure that for every exam question that has a case study attached to it, which we've noticed through our exam analysis has been happening more frequently over the last few years with the VCAR exams. We know that it can be quite daunting for a student to look at a question where they need to analyse something and it's in relation to a business case study. It can be hard for the student to know how to approach that. So what we do is we scaffold that question by giving them, prior to the exam style question, we give them what we call a case study skills question, which is usually like something like a multiple choice or a true or false, where the answers kind of given to the student in a roundabout way so that they can then use that knowledge that they've gained from the skills question to answer the more complex exam style question. So this example demonstrates that how we can scaffold that for the student. So because the student is required to answer each true or false question, having regard to the viewpoint of each stakeholder in this case. Now, I don't expect you to read the whole case study, but basically they're taking on the viewpoint of each stakeholder by answering that true or false question, so that when they are asked the more complex exam style question, how to analyse the impact of something on the stakeholders or particular stakeholders, they already have done that case study skills question that leads them to think about how they're going to analyse that from a stakeholder's perspective. When we provide an answer to students, which we do have answers provided for every question, there's a model response and there's also an answer checklist. So we will give we'll break that down, and the student is able to look at each sentence or two in that response and identify what has been included in the response to see whether they would get those full marks. So you won't have time to look at all of that now, but you can perhaps go back and have a look at this checklist and the model response. We include these for every exam style question in the textbook, and we have exam style questions for every dot point and indeed every knowledge unit or concept that is mentioned in each dot point. I think I'm nearly done with looking at these questions. I think this is the last one. We do just have some other exam style questions that are not attached to case studies. Here's an example where we will take a dot point, and here's one that has changed in the new study design, the one on waste minimisation. We will take an exam style question, which is always designed based on similar questions from VCAR in past years. And then we can also couple that with a testing previous knowledge question within that same lesson, just to remind students that they do need to keep going back and looking at what they've learned in past weeks or past lessons, because that can always come up again in relation to the same topic or the same case study or in a similar scenario. So you can have a look at those perhaps in more detail after the webinar when you get a copy of the slides to have a closer look at those examples. But I think that's me finishing all of Edrolo's examples. So another chance to add some comments to the Q&A. And it's great to see people have been introducing themselves in their in the Q&A. If you came to us a little bit late, we had a problem with the chat function. It wasn't working, basically. And so we've just suggested that people add their comments or information about who they are, where they're from, any questions you've got to the Q&A section. Just having a quick look there. And I did ask earlier in the webinar if people would like to trial the Edrolo textbook. We're offering sample chapters at the moment. We're also offering providing the topic that you would probably be doing for Head Start, which I suspect is usually the area of study 1 or outcome 1 in units 1 and 3. But please let me know if there are other topics that you start with for Head Start. We can see if we can arrange a sample for that topic for you instead. But that's basically all from me. And I will be passing you over to Dion. Just before I do that, one quick thing, sorry Dion, at the start we were looking at the babies and deciding which baby we were, how we were feeling, and I said I hope that you're feeling a little bit more close to baby number 2 or baby 3 by now. So if you are, let us know in the Q&A as we go over, and I pass over to Dion. Dion's going to talk to you about our online platform. So what I'll do, I'll stop sharing, Dion, and let you.
Yeah, perfect.
For information. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Kristen. That was wonderful. And it's so good to have you sort of take us through all those study design changes, which I believe will be a lot clearer for teachers now. I'm going to share my screen. I'll be about 5 minutes. I promise I won't, well, actually, no, I'll try to promise to not go past 5 p.m. But I'm just going to quickly show you what the online platform actually looks like. So Kristen's taking you through the study design and through the textbooks and how the textbooks look, but that's one part of the bigger story. And yeah, we obviously have textbooks for a whole bunch of different subjects at Edrolo. So yeah, feel free to ask me any questions in the Q&A. That just a nice little FYI. The reason why the chat was disabled was because we ran a student session for a whole bunch of students, and you can imagine what it's like when you open up the chat to a whole bunch of students, what can happen. So we know, because we're an experienced company, we know that to disable the chat when we run student sessions. So yeah, that's why that hasn't been working. So these are all of the textbooks that we have at Edrolo. I believe there's about 16, and all of the study design changes that are taking place next year. That's Chem 1-2, Physics 1-2, Psych 1-4, BizMan 1-4, and General Maths 1-4. We are updating all of our textbooks. So I thought I'd flag that. We also have resources for year 7 and 8. So we have a science textbook, and we also have a maths textbook as well. And these are currently being trialed by schools, and teachers are really, really loving it. So what I'm actually going to give you the opportunity in a minute to do is to leave your details. And if you want to trial any of science or year 7 or 8 science or maths, or if you want to trial any of these textbooks, you can do that. And you can do that. It's a full-blown trial with your class. And yeah, you'll be able to do that. The other one we've got a year 7 humanities resource coming as well. And that's going to be available next year. And we have some samples available for that as well. So if you are interested in trialing any of our textbooks from this year's study design, we've got samples of next year's study designs that we can send around to you as well. I want you to head to this URL. So edrolo.com.au/bizman. And I'll give you a few seconds to either use your phone, that's actually a QR code, use your phone to take down that address. But this is the way that you can send us information about who you are, and then we'll get in touch and we'll set up a trial for you in any of the VCE textbooks or any of the year 7 or 8 resources as well. Great. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you, if you are not already familiar with what Edrolo looks like when you use it online, what does this thing actually look like? So the first thing I wanted to show you was what it looks like from the student perspective. Actually, I'm going to go back to this previous page here. So when I'm actually logged into a student account here, this is just the new account that we've opened. So one thing that students have is they have theory videos that are linked to every topic in the study design. You can see that there's a collection of videos there, and students can go in and use these videos as a way of, teachers use this to sort of flip the classrooms. The students can learn before they come into class.
Taking into
so here's a teacher teaching the course, and I believe I've got that slowed down. That's what the teacher was speaking slowly. So that's one aspect of Edrolo that students have access to. But this textbook component of Edrolo that students have access to, obviously they have access to the PDF of the textbook, but then they've got access to all of these questions here. And these questions are exactly the same questions that are in the textbook, but they actually have been digitized. And so what it looks like is when a student goes into a question, let's say it's a multi-choice question, they get immediate feedback on the question. But the other thing they get is they also get a video solution of a teacher guiding them through the correct answer.
This question asks us to choose the management style that would best suit Zach.
So this is super useful for students that are maybe down the bottom end of the class that don't quite understand, what they need to do to answer this question, but also students up the top end who are really trying to hone their knowledge. It gets particularly useful when the students then self-reflect on their understanding of if they're confident or not in the question that they've completed. But it gets particularly useful for these short answer questions. So this is my answer. A student would enter their answer. And as I said, these are exactly the same questions that are in the book, but they're digitized. And so once again, a student gets a video solution, but they also get a checklist and an exemplar response. So what we find from talking to teachers myself, teachers just save lots and lots of time in completing and getting students to complete these checklists themselves. You can even see when you go over the checklist or when the student does that, they can see in the exemplar response where it comes from. And once again, they can indicate if they're confident or not in their understanding of the material. So this is a big time saver because if you want to send any textbook question to your students, they have either they get self-corrected with the multi-choice questions, or they have a checklist that actually guides them through the whole answer. But for you as a teacher, what you get is you get some really, really cool data. So the data that you get from this, and now I'm looking at a teacher account here, the data that you get is really, really rich. So for those videos, I showed you before that students get those theory videos that they can watch. Well, teachers can go in and you can see exactly how many of the videos that the students have watched and the rating they've given themselves after they've watched those videos. For the textbook questions that I just showed you, this is the kind of data that you can get from the textbook questions. So this is actually a class in Victoria that uses the BizMan textbook. And you can see here that there's a whole bunch of data on what the student is getting incorrect and correct in terms of the multi-choice questions. But then if you see here, this student has actually indicated it's a short answer question, that they need help with that question after even watching the video. And so what you can do as a teacher, so I'm having to move this down because my Zoom's in the way. What you can do as a teacher is you actually get access to all of this data. So you can see, right, this is the question that the students were asked. This is the answer. And you get to see as a teacher the checklist and the exemplar response and the video solution. But then you get to see, right, how have my students answered this question? And have they worked through that checklist? And so here you can see some students have, you've got my students who've completed this question. So this student has indicated that they understand the question, that's their answer, but then they've actually marked themselves as not understanding 2 components of the checklist. So as a teacher, this is really handy because this is just all about data-led teaching. So it means that you can just flick through these questions, see where there are hotspots, see where students need help with particular questions. And it's a big relief for teachers because it means that the weight is off their shoulders in terms of having to mark every single question and also having to get a read on how their students are actually going with completing the questions. That's a bit of a whirlwind tour of the resource. If you do want to trial one of these textbooks, you can. It's free to trial it. And what we ask you to do is just set aside your existing textbook this year for an area of study, let's say the final area of study, if you like, or just even for a topic, and then use the online resource. We'll even send you out a free book as well. And if you confirm that you're actually going ahead with the textbook for next year, so let's say you're not currently using the BizMan textbook this year and you're really, really keen to give it a go. If you like it and booklist it next year, we'll actually give you and your students completely free access to the end of the year. If you don't want to continue using it for the rest of the year, that's all good. We'll just remove that digital access, but at least you've had the opportunity to trial it. So the fun part, once again, if you would all like to go, if you're interested in trialing one of our books, go to edrolo.com.au/BUSMAN, and I'll just give you a minute to visit that URL and to enter your details. It only takes probably about 30 seconds, and you can indicate what textbooks you would like to trial. The other thing I'll say as well is that if you're currently using the standard Edrolo resource, which is just the videos and the tests, and you're using a non-Edrolo textbook, you will find that it's very refreshing to have a textbook that aligns totally with the Edrolo online resource. Teachers really love that they can say to their students, hey, we're turning to, chapter 4C, and the students know that they can watch a video theory lesson on 4C and know that when they open the book, it'll be the same chapter. So that sort of, having them in sync is, a thing that teachers really love, and students as well. I can see a few people have filled out that form. Thank you so much. I'll just give you a few minutes. I know it's the end of the day. I know typing in a form is probably the last thing you want to do, but it's a really, really good opportunity to trial our book and see how you go with your class. And as I said, a trial includes a hard copy book that we send to you. I can see a few more have submitted the form. Thank you. Was there anything
Amelia
else?
has backed you up, Dion, which is always nice.
Was there anything else that you both wanted to cover? Any little additions?
No, just to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. We have passed 5 o'clock and we'd promised we'd get you out on time. So a lot of information has been shared this afternoon. So thank you, Kristen and Dion. As we said earlier, we will be sending out an email with the recording, with the slides, with your certificate of participation, as well as contact details. You know how to find us if you have any questions at all, either for Kristen about the study design that come to you in the middle of the night, hopefully not, or for Dion in terms of the textbooks or the online resources, or wanting to get a trial, you can reach out to us, of course, at any time. So thank you all for joining us. There is a quick question from Xing Yang. Dion, if we're already using Edrolo at the school, is the trial set up?
Oh, that's a good question. So You can actually send me an email. If you want to send me an email, I can look into it if you like. If you're using Edrolo in the standard resource and you want to trial the textbook, please fill in that form. So yeah, you're probably best just to fill in the form, and we can sort of we'll qualify that, and we'll make sure that that's actually something that you can trial. So yeah, I highly recommend filling in the form, edrolo.com.au/bizman. Thanks for asking.
Great. No other questions from anyone? Then we will call it an evening. Stay safe, have a great night, and we will hopefully see you again soon, either in person or online. Take care.
See you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.